Most people think the loudest voice in the room holds the most power. They're wrong. The most dangerous mind in history didn't roar, it went quiet. Marcus Aurelius was one of the most powerful men alive. He commanded legions, he signed execution orders, he held the fate of millions in one hand and a leather journal in the other. And every single morning, before the world could get to him, he sat in silence and did something most people today will never do. He interrogated his own mind, not journaled his feelings, not meditated on vibes. He cross-examined his own thinking, like a lawyer going after a hostile witness. And that practice, that one silent ritual, is why he didn't crack under the weight of an empire. What you're about to learn is not what gets posted in aesthetic quote graphics. This is the raw mechanics. Stay with me. Here's what nobody talks about when they sell you Stoicism. The philosophy doesn't work in motion. You can't access it in traffic, in an argument, in a panic spiral. It only loads when the noise stops. Silence isn't a mood, it's a weapon, and most people are handing it back unused every single day. The ancient Stoics had a phrase, anakoresis esaltenchlo, which translates roughly to retreat into yourself, not a vacation, not a detox, a deliberate, strategic withdrawal from the noise so you can go to war with your own assumptions. I'm going to walk you through 10 specific methods drawn from Stoic texts, modern neuroscience, and some uncomfortable truths that show you exactly how silence rewires the mind, not as a metaphor, as a literal cognitive process. Stay until the end. Point 7 alone will change how you move through every single day. Core content, 10 points. 1. The input audit. Starving the noise machine. Before you can rewire anything, you have to cut the power to the old circuit. Epictetus, a former slave, who became one of the sharpest minds in Western philosophy, taught that most human suffering isn't caused by events. It's caused by the relentless commentary we allow around those events. Think of your mind as a lake. When 50 people are throwing rocks in from every direction, you can't see the bottom, you can't even see your reflection. Social media, 24-hour news, other people's opinions, these are rocks. They don't stop unless you stop them. The Stoic method starts with an input audit, a ruthless, honest inventory of what you let into your mental space and at what volume, not a fast, a permanent recalibration. Epictetus didn't say reduce noise. He said remove what you cannot control from your attention entirely. Most people treat that like a suggestion. The ones who treat it like a command, they're operating at a completely different level. But here's the thing, cutting input is only half the equation. The other half is what you do in the silence you just created. 2. The mirror sit, facing the unedited version of yourself. Most people are terrified of silence, not because nothing happens, but because something does. You start hearing yourself. And that voice, it's often not who you thought you were. Marcus Aurelius described this in Meditations with brutal precision. He wrote about looking at his own impulses without flattery, seeing greed dressed up as ambition, fear disguised as caution, laziness performing as patience. The mirror sit is simple, 10 minutes. No phone, no music, no task. You sit, and when a thought surfaces, you don't run with it, you name it. That's anxiety pretending to be planning. That's ego disguised as principle. You become the taxonomist of your own mental weather. Neuroscience calls this metacognition, thinking about thinking. It activates the prefrontal cortex and literally starts to loosen the grip of the amygdala, the brain's panic station. The Stoics just called it clarity. Either way, it requires sitting still long enough to be uncomfortable. Once you can name the voice, you can do something even more powerful. You can replace it. And that's where the real rewiring begins. 3. Voluntary discomfort in quiet. Training without screaming. The Stoics practice something called ascesis, voluntary hardship, not suffering for the sake of suffering, controlled exposure to discomfort, so that real discomfort loses its teeth. But here's the version nobody teaches. The most effective ascesis isn't physical, it's mental. It's the practice of sitting with an uncomfortable thought, a fear, a resentment, a grief, in total silence, without reaching for a distraction. Think of it like building calluses. The first time a thought terrifies you, it has power. The fifth time you've sat with it in silence, examined it, refused to let it chase you, it starts to look like what it actually is, a weather pattern, not a permanent climate. A 2018 study from Yale's Mind and Development Lab found that people who regularly engaged in non-reactive observation of stressful thoughts reported a 32% reduction in emotional reactivity over 8 weeks. They didn't fix the thoughts, they just stopped being afraid of them. That's ascesis. That's the forge. But training alone isn't enough. You also need to redirect, because where you aim, silence matters just as much as how long you sit in it. 4. The philosophical compass, giving silence a direction. Empty silence is a room with no furniture. Directed silence is a command center. The difference, intention. The Stoics didn't just go quiet, they went quiet with a question. What is within my control right now? Am I responding to this situation or reacting to my story about it? What would I advise my best friend if this were happening to them? These aren't therapy prompts, they're precision instruments. The philosophical compass technique means entering every silence with one single question, not a list written on paper beforehand. You let the question sit in you like a stone dropped in still water. You don't force an answer, you wait for one to surface. Seneca wrote letters to himself, not diary entries, actual arguments. He'd pose a claim, then argue against it in his own mind until clarity appeared. That process happened in silence with direction, not drifting, hunting. Now here's where it gets physiological, because what silence actually does to your brain chemistry is something most people have never been told. 5. The default mode reset. What happens when you stop performing? Your brain has a factory setting. It's called the default mode network, a cluster of regions that activate when you're not focused on an external task. This is the network responsible for self-reflection, future planning, and meaning-making. Here's the problem. Constant stimulation, scrolling, podcasts, background noise suppresses the default mode network. You're essentially jamming the frequency on which your deepest thinking occurs. The Stoics didn't have neuroscience, but they had the instinct. Seneca wrote, "Recede in tips, withdraw into yourself." He was describing exactly this, disconnecting from external performance to let the internal network come back online. When you allow 20 minutes of genuine silence, no input, no output, your default mode network fires up, begins integrating recent experiences, surfaces unresolved problems, and starts building the narrative architecture that gives your life coherence. This isn't woo, this is neurology. Your brain is running a repair process in the background every time you go quiet, but most people never let the program finish loading. Point 6 shows you how to accelerate it. 6. Strategic amnesia, the art of forgetting on purpose. This one sounds backwards, but the Stoics were obsessed with it. Marcus Aurelius wrote about deliberately calling to mind the transient nature of things, not to be morbid, but to release his grip on outcomes he couldn't control. Strategic amnesia in silence means this: you enter a quiet space and you consciously practice letting a grievance, a grudge, or a fear go, not by resolving it, but by choosing to remove it from active memory. You aren't suppressing it, you're reassigning it. This does not require my attention today. The analogy that fits: your conscious mind is like RAM limited, fast, constantly overloaded. Persistent grievances are programs running in the background, consuming power you need elsewhere. Strategic amnesia is manually closing the tabs. Marcus did this before every council meeting, before every military decision. He'd purge the emotional residue of the previous day so his judgments weren't contaminated by yesterday's frustrations. His silence wasn't passive, it was a form of mental hygiene, disciplined, deliberate, and repeatable. But there's a deeper layer here, because silence doesn't just clear old wiring. Under the right conditions, it builds entirely new architecture, and that process has a name: identity rehearsal. Building the person you haven't met yet. Here's the point I promised you. This one will feel strange before it feels obvious. The Stoics believed that character, what they called ethos, was not fixed. It was a practice. You didn't discover who you were. You constructed who you became through repeated, deliberate action. But the construction starts in imagination. Identity rehearsal is the practice of using silence to mentally inhabit the future version of yourself with precision, not as a visualization exercise, but as a behavioral blueprint. In silence you ask, how does the version of me who has already solved this problem sit, think, speak? Then you practice embodying that posture in the quiet. Modern cognitive science calls this self-concept expansion. When you repeatedly simulate a future self in a relaxed state, the brain begins to encode those patterns as familiar rather than foreign, lowering the psychological resistance to actually becoming that person. Epictetus rehearsed his responses to insults in silence before they happened, so that when they came, he wasn't improvising, he was executing a plan. Silence was his rehearsal studio. What comes next is about using that studio with even more precision. 8. The constraint method. Thinking better by thinking less. There's a cognitive trap that silence exposes immediately. The belief that more thinking equals better thinking. It doesn't. More thinking equals more noise. The Stoic constraint method says this: in silence, give yourself one and only one question, one problem, one decision to hold. Not a list. One. Then refuse to move until that single thing has been turned over completely. Think of it like a lens and sunlight. Sunlight across a field is warm but harmless. The same sunlight focused through a single point of glass starts a fire. Silence is your lens. The single question is your focal point. Everything else is diffusion. Seneca was famous for this. His letters, dense, precise, almost surgical, were the product of single question silence sessions. He would take one idea, sit with it completely, and refuse to chase tangents. The result was insight that still slaps 2,000 years later. The next method takes this internal work and turns it outward, specifically into the moments when life will test everything you've built in the quiet. 9. The pre-mortem quiet. Winning before you enter the room. This technique is borrowed from Stoic negative visualization premeditatio malorum and is the single most underused cognitive tool available to anyone who's willing to be uncomfortable. Before any high-stakes event, a confrontation, a presentation, a difficult conversation, you enter silence and you walk through the worst version of the outcome, fully, in detail. You don't stop at the disaster, you keep going, and then what, and then what, until you reach the other side of it, still alive, still functional, still yourself. This isn't pessimism, this is inoculation. When your nervous system has already simulated the worst, the actual event has less capacity to hijack your cognitive function. You've removed the element of shock, which is where most people fall apart. Marcus Aurelius did this before battles, before Senate hearings, before issuing judgments he knew would create enemies. He wasn't reckless, he was preloaded. His silence was preparation disguised as stillness. And the final method ties everything together, because after you've cleared, rehearsed, constrained, and prepared in silence, there's one last thing the Stoics demanded you do with what you found. 10. The commitment in quiet. Making decisions that stick. Every piece of inner work collapses without this final step. Decisions made in noise are made by a fractured self, pulled by urgency, peer pressure, fear, desire. Decisions made in silence are made by the self you actually want to be. The Stoics treated silent commitment as a kind of internal oath not sworn to gods or witnesses, but to the self's own standard of reason. Chrysippus, the third head of the Stoic school, taught that the commitment to virtue had to be chosen in a state of rational clarity, not emotional heat. The practice is simple, but requires discipline. When a significant decision arises, you do not make it until you've sat in silence with it for at least one full session. Not to delay, but to ensure the decision reflects your reasoned values, not your reactive impulse. The decisions made in silence last because they were made by the version of you that actually thought, not the version running on adrenaline, caffeine, and social comparison. The world gets louder every year. The signal-to-noise ratio is broken. which means the people who master silence, who use it deliberately, strategically and courageously, aren't just calmer. They're operating from a different layer of reality entirely. Here's the uncomfortable truth you've been circling this whole video. The silence was always available. It wasn't a resource you lacked. It was a resource you avoided, because what's in there can be confronting. Your mind is not broken, it's overstimulated. And the ancient Stoics, who faced plagues, wars, political betrayal, and public execution, figured out that the path through all of it ran inward, not outward. 10 methods. 1 directive: go quiet with intention. Not once, not when life gets bad. Every morning, before the world gets its hands on you. If this cracked something open for you, drop a comment with the one method that hit hardest. I read every single one, and the patterns in those responses shape what gets made next on this channel. If you're not subscribed yet and you actually want to think at a higher level, the button's right there. No pressure. But the people who stick around, they keep telling me these videos are changing the way they move through the world. I'll see you in the next one. Stay sharp, stay quiet.